All right. God.
Why, internet? Why?
I know. Thank you, Zach. That's how I felt about it, too.
Yeah.
Oh, we were doing so good.
I can't understand it.
We streamed all week, and that shit didn't happen. Now I'm gonna have to, like, fucking Hulk out again.
Yeah.
Wait, why is it so much brighter in here now?
I don't know. Some weird shit, isn't it?
Where's that light coming from?
I don't know.
It's really weird because I feel like the last time was like really dark, and now it's like really light, and I can't see.
Yeah.
I can't see where the light's coming from.
Okay, we're here, so go ahead, bro.
We're back again.
Go ahead.
I'm bro.
Hit that
now.
like button.
I'm bro now.
Yeah.
Maybe someone doesn't.
I called you bro.
I think you. Well, I thought you did. I don't know.
No,
maybe you
didn't.
didn't.
It's in your mind.
Okay, he's gaslighting me.
I didn't say. I didn't call you bro. She said I called her bro. I didn't call you bro.
It sounded like bro.
No.
Maybe it wasn't. All right, so let's talk about Jung and Freud, and let's talk about the differences between the two. Now, here's one thing I was telling Tom because I thought he would appreciate this little anecdote. This was something that I read in a biography of Jung, and this was one of the things that kind of highlighted the fundamental difference between the two of them, which led to their rift later on. So they kind of came from the same framework, I guess, because Jung was about 20 years younger than Freud. Jung was kind of seen as... Freud kind of saw him as his successor. He even called him like the crown prince, like he was going to be the guy that was going to, carry on that particular theory into the future. I think, at least according to one biography that I read, I think one consideration that Freud had was that you have to understand that in the context of the time period, a lot of psychiatrists, a lot of psychologists and stuff like that were Jewish. And I think that Freud was afraid that psychology was going to be seen as like a Jewish discipline. So I think he was very excited that someone like Carl Jung, who was not Jewish, was going to be carrying on the mantle so it didn't look like a particularly Jewish kind of shit. So that might have been a consideration also. But the thing about it, they both kind of came at things from a similar point of view in the sense that you had, the conscious mind, you had the subconscious or unconscious mind, which in Freud's point of view had all of your bad shit, like all of your repressed memories that was causing all of your fucked up like neuroses and shit like that later on. You had all that going on. And then, Freud also had something called the id, which, Jung had sort of a thing that was kind of like that too, like an archetype called the shadow that was kind of similar. But one thing that Jung had that Freud did not have, and this was one point of contention between the two of them, was that Jung thought that underneath your conscious mind, which is obviously all of the shit that you're conscious of, your personality, your ongoing sense of yourself as an individual, then you had your subconscious or your unconscious, which was not necessarily bad shit, but just all the kind of stuff that you weren't like aware of, memories that were repressed or shit that was going on underneath the surface that you weren't necessarily aware of. Jung thought that there was something else underpinning that, which he called the collective unconscious. Now he kind of, and this again was a big place where he differed with Freud. Freud did not have anything like this. Jung thought that there was a well, essentially, of, I guess you call it like species-specific memories or species-specific symbolism that all humans could access, I suppose. You know what I'm saying?
Kind of like a combination between heaven and hell.
Because, and one thing that he kind of, and I'm not like totally averse to this idea. He was kind of coming at it from the point of view where, look, they've accepted evolution as true at this point, and they're kind of like, well, everything else evolves, like our physical forms evolve and everything, so our brains must have evolved as well, which obviously they did. So he's like, so we must have some kind of like species-specific, not even species specific, because it goes back to before we were even humans. There must be something imprinted in the brains of all that you kind of inherit from ancestors, whether they were human ancestors or even going back before humans. And as evidence of that, he pointed out to the similarities, because he was, as I said, he was very into mythology. He was very into studying like comparative religion, all that kind of stuff. So he's like, look, you see similar symbols and similar stories and similar, it's like coming up in vastly disparate cultures. So there must be something underpinning that everyone is kind of plugging into.
Kind of like that thing out of Altered States.
Yeah.
Remember Altered States?
Well, I kind of feel like that's
where they got this.
That's where they got that. Well, and like I said, Jungian theory is so ingrained, I feel like, in particularly in mysticism, in like artistic kind of, you know, mindsets, people with artistic mindsets. I kind of feel like it's so ingrained that you might not even realize that it comes from one particular person. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
Just because his ideas have so permeated throughout the culture at large. But as I said, it's not a crazy theory, because we did evolve. We did evolve from, you know, other species. We're all interconnected. So it's not crazy to think that we might have some kind of well of particular symbology, imagery that we're all drawing from, and that causes us to have the same kind of emotional reactions to them. You know what I mean? So that's kind of where he was coming from. He's kind of saying, like, you know, you have your conscious mind on the top, then you got your subconscious mind, which is your personal unconscious. That's your own shit. That's repressed memories or whatever. But what he didn't see that as necessarily negative, which I think Freud did. And that was, again, another point of contention. But then he went a step further and said, no, there is an actual, like a species or a racial kind of thing, like underpinning all of it, when we're all kind of drawing from this same wellspring, because we've all evolved from the same thing.
Mark says we evolved from Pookies.
We did.
Yeah.
Well, see, this is why I talk to Pookie like a person, because
evolved from Pookies.
Me and Pookie are very, we have very similar DNA. She is like a tiny person. She just can't really talk. She kind of talks, but like, you know, not in human words.
A Pookie is not a non-human. It is a type of human. They just don't have the ability to fucking actually explain things. You know what I'm talking about?
But she's pretty good at getting her feelings across and getting her point across.
Right. It's all fucking visual.
I mean, she doesn't seem to have that hard of a time letting us know what she wants.
Right.
I mean, she seems pretty astute in that
So
regard.
being evolved from Pookies isn't necessarily a bad thing.
I am totally not, I would not be offended by that at all. That's what that's one thing that always kind of bothered me about people that were, because I used to be, like, way back in the day, I was, like, really fascinated by creationists and, like, what their fucking problem was. And it seemed to me that they got really offended by being, we evolved from apes.
Non-human,
even though that's not technically correct.
Yeah.
You know, we have obviously we have a common ancestor with apes. We didn't evolve from apes in the sense that, because obviously their apes are still around, but it's, it's a branching thing, obviously. But it seemed to me that was something that was like making them not want to believe it, because they were offended. But it's like, oh, you're saying that I came from a monkey.
Right.
Like, they seemed like they were really offended by
monkeys were Pookies too.
I'm like, one, monkeys are awesome, so shut up. And two, I don't understand why that's offensive to you. No. And it's like, no one's saying that you came from a monkey, like, so basically you might as well just throw your poop at people. Yeah. Nobody is saying that.
Right.
Clearly.
Because the monkeys were like, what? Hey.
You know I'd be more offended if I was a monkey that humans evolved from us.
You'd be offended by the monkey? What the fuck?
Why are monkeys not offensive?
Nope.
And actually, we've been watching videos of those gorillas, like in that zoo or whatever.
They're very human.
And they're always, honestly,
They're
they
more
act
human than human.
they act just like people. So I don't understand why anybody could
they'd be
think
like...
that the shit that they do is like, you can tell what's going on in their minds because they're acting just like a fucking human acts.
Yeah.
The facial expressions, their body language, everything. Yeah. I don't understand why anyone would find that offensive.
Nothing unusual about them.
It's not offensive at all.
It's right within human parameters. They're like, what?
And they're delightful creatures.
Yeah.
Why is anyone offended by that? I don't really know.
Right.
I'd be offended if I was a monkey to be compared to a person, to be honest with you. But yeah, I didn't get that. So yeah, like I said, so I don't think that's like totally weird. I know there might not be a lot of like scientific evidence to back it up, but you could see where Jung was coming from, where he's saying, look, it's all across the world. We have these really common symbols, and a lot of common stories and a lot of things that come up in people's mythology and stuff like that that are really, really similar to one another, even though ostensibly these cultures did not interact. So there must be something ingrained in the human brain that is making that manifest. You know what I'm saying? So it's like, that's not that crazy a thing. So he kind of like went a lot farther than Freud did, because I feel like Freud, you know, and I'm not shitting on Freud. I know it's, you know, cool to shit on Freud or whatever, but it's like, he did kind of have, I feel like Freud's outlook was a lot narrower. As I said, Freud was he didn't have a lot of patience for any kind of mystical stuff. He didn't have a lot of patience for any paranormal stuff, which, like I said, I get that because I, you know, don't either generally. But in that sense, I feel like he went a little too narrow in his outlook because he, as I mentioned earlier, said pretty much everything that's the matter with you, and as I said, this is a simplification, everything that's the matter with you can generally be tied back to some trauma that you experienced as a child, and it was generally probably a sexual trauma or something to do with your genitalia, whether it was like toilet training or, as I said, maybe your mom looked at your junk funny or something like that, and that caused all your problems. All we have to do is identify what that was, and then we can fix it. That was another thing too, because I feel like Freud, their kind of thrust was to identify the basis of people's neuroses so that they could fix them. I feel like Jung was less focused on fixing stuff as he was identifying commonalities in people's experiences and using that to come to a better understanding of one's personal identity. You know what I'm saying? Because he came out with, you know, he came up with the whole thing later, which was, he had, you know, the theory of archetypes, obviously, which is not, I feel like that's kind of like portrayed as, I feel like that gets portrayed a lot as like fucking tarot card kind of shit, like, right. You know, like which I guess that's kind of accurate, but that's not really what it was. It's just kind of like these kind of parts of your psyche that, I don't know, it's like, it's really, really hard for me to explain, but it's kind of like parts of your psyche that what you're trying to do is reach what he called individuation, which is kind of, you're getting to a balance between your conscious self, your subconscious self, and the collective unconscious. You're kind of getting to this point where everything is in balance with one another. So I feel like that was kind of his goal. Not so much fixing what was wrong with you, but maintaining a balance of your identity, you know, in compared to everyone else's identity and like your relationship with the world. You know what I mean? Yeah. Maybe I'm like interpreting that wrong, but that's kind of how I'm seeing it.
I never really was fucking hip with fucking these fucking 19th century guys and the way that they saw things. I always thought that with the way these guys approached stuff was a little bit too systematic. You know what I mean?
Yeah, you can see what
Like
they
there
were.
was-
Yeah, that was like a big thing back then. We want to like break everything down.
Yeah,
into,
break
like,
things
fucking-
down in some kind of system, and I never really. Reality isn't really like that, but they were trying to invent a science, if you ask me.
Yeah.
You know, they're writing books, so they're going to invent a science on the back of writing a book, and they're going to try to make some kind of a method. That's the way I always saw.
Well, they were trying to
That type of
distill
stuff.
the complication
Right.
of human existence, which is very complicated, down to a system that, you know, if something was
Yeah.
bothering you, you know, you could do A, B, and C,
Right.
and then you would get to a, and that's not always going to work.
Yeah, that's not the way life is. Nowadays, it would be some dude on the internet trying to come up with a meme to explain it. That's the way it would be today. It would
Like
be some kind of meme lord. You know what I mean? Doesn't necessarily mean that they were wrong. It just means that
Well, they only
these
captured
guys-
like a portion of.
Yeah. They're trying to give it to you in the fucking in the 1800s sense of the word. You know what I mean? That's the only way I can really.
And as I said, I feel like it's very human to want to find systematic or very simple solutions to things. Which, like I
Yeah.
said, I'm not shitting on people. That's just a very human thing to want to do, because, you know, you like to think, look, I have this problem, and I want to be able to do X, Y, Z to solve
Right.
it. But that's not always how shit works out.
Yeah, I always saw what these guys did as trying to make a science.
Sure.
That's the way I always.
Which, as I said, you have to. There wasn't anything like this prior to that.
Yeah.
And as I said, I do feel like aspects of even Freudian and Jungian analysis has been of value to people in the modern age. So you can't say, you know, I'm not saying that it fixes everyone's problems, obviously. But if it's helped people, then it has contributed something of value. It's just that I'm always really leery of anybody that says that they've come up with a system to solve any fucking problem that you have. But, you know, as I said, so I do agree with Jung that he thought Freud's shit was like too reductive. He's like, look, you tie every problem back to someone's like sexual traumas from their childhood. Everything is negative, like all the shit. Because basically Freud's thing about the subconscious or the unconscious was that was all like your repressed memories, and in that sense they were repressed because they were too unpleasant for you to deal with. So it was all like negative shit. Now Jung was like, he was a lot more open-minded than that. He's like, look, that's too negative. It's like, you know, my unconscious, or, you know, theory of the unconscious mind, it's not, yes, there's repressed memories in there, but it's not all negative. It's just anything is in there. It's like shit you don't remember, like shit, there's all kind of stuff in there. It doesn't necessarily mean that it's repressed because it was too horrible for you to deal with, or, you know, nothing like that. And also another difference was that Freud kind of thought that, well, your childhood was responsible for everything that happened to you going forward. Like into your adulthood, there was always something that could be tied back to some like shit that happened to you in childhood. Jung thought that was, like I said, a little narrow. And he's like, look, well, what about people's future aspirations? What about that kind of... So he kind of thought... He kind of had like a more well-rounded view, I guess, because he's just like, look, everything isn't about your past. Everything isn't about past trauma. Everything that you do doesn't necessarily have to do with some bad shit that happened to you when you were a kid. You know, what about what your dreams are? What about what your aspirations are? What is it, you know, that can influence your personality as well. So he was kind of a lot more open in that regard. Now, another thing that Jung did too, he was, because we kind of got into this a little bit as well, because I know you probably wanted to talk about this too because of the poltergeist thing. Jung was a big advocate of, you know, he believed in paranormal activity, but he kind of had the same view of it that you have, in the sense that he believed that poltergeist activity existed, but he thought that it was a manifestation or an exteriorization, which was a word that he used exactly, of someone's mental turmoil. Now, I was telling him about an anecdote where he and his wife, like Jung and his wife, were in Vienna visiting Freud, and they were kind of having a little bit of an argument about paranormal activity, because Freud was like a he was an atheist, and he was like a super skeptic about any kind of paranormal activity. He thought it was all bullshit. Jung was not so much. He didn't think it was supernatural, as in the sense that he didn't think it was ghosts, but he thought that it was, some kind of exteriorization of people's mental states. So they're having an argument like in a library or a study or something. And then while they're having the argument, this really big banging noise like comes out of the bookshelf, right? And Jung says, that's exactly what I'm talking about. We're having an argument about this shit right now. We're getting upset about it. And that's an exteriorization of how upset we're getting about this fucking issue. And Freud did not buy it. He's like, whatever, fuck that. It was just like some kind of like, it was a coincidence. It was a random noise.
Yeah.
And then allegedly, Jung said, yeah, well, I'll prove it to you. It's going to do it again in a minute. And apparently it did. So that was another kind of, this was right around maybe a year or so before they had their final falling out, where they didn't really talk to each other anymore, because there were some pretty fundamental differences in their worldviews that I guess it got to a point. They worked together. They were in, it's weird too, because I feel like there was some kind of, a few biographies have said they never, the two of them never, like, obviously had sex with each other or anything.
Wait, what?
But there was some kind of, like, Freud even said in a letter to someone else that he had, like, some kind of quote-unquote, like, wild homosexual feelings toward Jung.
Damn.
And Jung kind of said that he had a crush on Freud, too. So I kind of feel like there was, like, a little bit of a sexual tension going on there. They didn't have sex with each other or anything like that. But there was some kind of, like, sexual tension going on with that. And I should note, too, that Jung was a big advocate of everyone being bisexual because of the whole anima animus thing, which he came about later on.
Wait a minute, animus.
Animus. Oh, you didn't know about that?
No.
Okay. So one of the things that he came up with, one of his archetypal things.
Yeah.
Anima is the female impulse, which is in every man. And animus is the male impulse, which is in every woman. He believed that every person, no matter what their gender, had the opposite gender, like that energy in them.
He's saying everybody's bi.
Yeah, I mean, that's essentially what he was saying. And he's saying that the problem is that people are taught to suppress that other side of them.
Bi back.
Yeah, well, like women are like taught, oh, don't be masculine, and like men are taught like don't be feminine. But he's like, that's really keeping people from reaching their full potential as people, because you're shutting off like a large aspect of your personality when you do that. So that was kind of like a big thing that he was talking about. So I don't think it's that weird that him and Freud were kind of like I said, nobody said they had sex with each other, because like I said, Jung was a huge fucking poon hound. But, it's not that strange to think that they had this stunt cut, because they were both very similar personalities and they had a lot of the same ideas, but they were also kind of a little bit in rivalry with one another. So I do kind of feel like there was like some weird sexual tension going on there. And as I said, they did kind of like admit it. At least Freud did. So that's not really that strange to me. But I think that might have contributed. One of the many things.
Sounds like some 1800s shit to me, actually.
Well, the weird thing about it is that you have to think too that in the 19th century,
the way these motherfuckers
it was
work.
much.
Yeah.
It's weird to think about nowadays.
They made a big deal out of nothing. If you ask me.
Here's the thing too: is that I think people think that gender roles were very rigid back then, but I think to some extent,
no, I don't think they were.
No, to some extent, in the Victorian era,
yeah, they were weird.
Men were a lot more effusive with their emotions towards their male friends, and in some ways, I mean, from everything, from all the literature that I've read from that time period, because like I said, I'm super into like Victorian fiction and shit like that. I do kind of feel like it was almost more acceptable to be more emotionally open with your male friends than it was with your, like, say, your wife.
There's a lot of fucking Victorian stuff to me is metrosexual as shit. Okay. They were also doing weird stuff like raising little boys as girls. Did you know that?
Well, no, they I mean,
they
if
were
you,
kind of like fucking, not really raising fucking young boys as girls. They were kind of like asexual.
yeah, they didn't really see.
Yeah.
I mean, if you see pictures of little boys from that time period,
yeah, they had them dressed as girls.
Well, yeah, they just had little dresses on.
Yeah,
everybody wore those.
Yeah.
They didn't really see that as girly or boyish necessarily. That was just something that babies wore.
I wouldn't listen to them dudes back then, man.
I'm just saying.
Yeah.
Well, it goes back to what we were saying before about
they were fucking weird.
Dudes just being like fainting at the last, and like
yeah.
sometimes I read like Victorian stories because like a lot of them are dudes, and because dudes wrote them and dudes were like the main characters and stuff. Even if women wrote them, like dudes are the main characters. And the dudes back then were like massive drama queens. It's like people talk about nowadays, but like the dudes back then, it's like they could not they just couldn't deal with anything.
And
they passed out and fucking shit.
Dudes of that era were not fucking physically, they weren't very physically fit. They didn't fucking work out.
Well, it wasn't a thing.
It wasn't a thing. And they were just like, come on. You know what I mean?
It wasn't a thing.
I ain't gonna talk about it.
Well, it's just interesting because I feel like people...
Those boys were fucking soy. They were soy
I do.
as shit.
Like I said, I feel like people...
They were soy as shit.
I feel like people have a misperception that in the Victorian era, the genders were very rigidly...
No.
It wasn't really...
I didn't have that.
It wasn't really like that. It wasn't really like that. And a lot of the stuff that you think about as masculine nowadays was not... considered masculine or was not seen in that way back then.
You can go back to the world wars in the fucking 30s and 40s when motherfuckers were killing each other with fucking wild abandon, okay? And if you looked at those fucking soldiers of that era, they were little skinny guys. They weren't very big. You know what I mean? You didn't see guys starting to come about into this whole physical fitness and being fucking macho and shit till the 70s. And that was only some of them.
Yeah, I mean, that's a pretty recent invention.
Yeah.
That's very recent.
That would be, fucking the original bodybuilders out on fucking Venice Beach in California in the 70s. Fucking Arnold and fucking all of his buddies. And that was only fucking a very small few that were into that. There are more. Here's something that fucking a lot of guys aren't understanding. During the golden age of bodybuilding, back in the 70s, all right, where guys were first starting to get really big, that was a tiny amount of men in terms of the fucking Earth's population. There are more guys now working out and getting huge than ever.
Yeah.
Ever. You know? So I just think it's funny.
Well, I always think it's funny, too, because, like I said, this is a thing, like, everybody talks about it. It's like, oh, dudes nowadays are such pussies, blah, blah, blah. No. It's like, look, dude, have you read Victorian fiction? Because, seriously.
The kind of guys they got right now on fucking YouTube, getting big and working out in the whole fitness thing, and fucking guys fucking with their own home gyms and taking all these weird fucking anabolic fucking compounds. That's all new.
Yeah, that's a pretty new thing.
And there are bigger dudes now than ever, and there are more of them than ever.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, and, shit like nowadays people think of like pink and blue, like that's like girls and boys. Up until the early 20th century, pink was considered a boy's color because it's like red. Yeah. And red was considered a masculine color. So blue was considered, that was like for girls. So this this shit, it's not, it's not something that is, static and everybody, like, oh, we're all, like, decided on what's masculine and feminine, like, throughout time or whatever like that. It's not really like that. It's very, very fucking fluid. But yeah, so the two of them, even though, what?
Sandra's in there talking about me on Wednesday, saying being gay in the middle of the pandemic, you can't do that. Like, that's when I was messing with what's his name. Knock it off, Sandra.
Why is being gay in the pandemic any different than
no,
in the pandemic?
I said something along. Zach, I was saying, Zach, look at Zach trying to be gay in the middle of a pandemic. That's what I said back then.
We're trying to be like actively gay,
yeah, he's
than
trying to be gay in the
gay?
fucking middle of. Got a whole fucking pandemic going on and got Zach trying to be gay in it. And fucking she's talking about that. I can't understand these
Where
people.
there's a will, there's a way.
Yeah.
That's all I'm gonna say.
Yeah, it's all fun and games.
These two dudes, as much as they were buddies and they loved each other, there was like a big rift coming. Like I said, Freud was too much of a rationalist, perhaps. Jung was more into, he had a little bit more of a mysticism thing going on, so there was that kind of thing. Jung thought that Freud was too narrow in his outlook, and that seemed to piss Freud off. Freud admitted later that he's like, nobody likes to be deposed, nobody likes, to think that somebody else is gonna, like, take their place or whatever, so there was, like, some egos, happening too. So there was that whole kind of thing that happened, where they didn't really want to look at each other's ideas. Now, the rift was kind of like, they kind of like saw each other for a little while, but it wasn't really like definitive until 1912, because Jung published Psychology of the Unconscious, and that was basically the last straw. Like, Freud wrote some letters being like, man, fuck this bitch. I'm paraphrasing. That's the end of it. I'm not, like, into it anymore. So basically, what ended up happening then, 1913, about a year after that book was published, Jung kind of, he started having some people would call it some mental issues. He called it a confrontation with the unconscious. He started hearing voices. He started seeing visions. He started to worry that maybe he was developing schizophrenia, or that he was getting some kind of psychosis or something like that. But what he did, to his credit, he was kind of freaked out by the whole shit, but being a psychologist, he was kind of like, maybe I should just kind of unplug and study this stuff as objectively as possible. So even though all of this stuff was very upsetting to him, he decided that he was going to start recording everything that he felt, everything that he saw, and he thought that that would be a really valuable tool for, whatever, going forward. So he decided, too, that he was going to start inducing hallucinations. As I said, I don't know if he was doing any kind of hallucinogenic drugs or anything like that, but he was definitely trying to encourage seeing hallucinations, because he thought that that would give him insight into his own psyche, and that would be valuable for other people going forward. As much as he was afraid of it, as much as he thought that it was like a frightening experience, he was going to lean into it. So what he started doing was, he had these little journals that were called, they're called the black books, even though a couple of them are brown, but whatever. He started writing down every dream that he had, every daydream that he had, every hallucination, any kind of weird shit that happened to him, he started writing it down. And so he had a whole bunch of those. I think there ended up being like 7 of those, which he called black books. And then he started transcribing them into what would later become called the Red Book, which was like this big leather-bound book. He called it Liber Novus, which is Latin for new book, obviously. And he started writing down everything in there. This was just some shit where, since he was going through a shitty time in his life, and you have to think too that this was around the time period that World War I broke out, which by all accounts was very traumatic for him also. He ended up he did actually serve in World War I. He got drafted into the army. He was but he was in Switzerland, so they were neutral. So what they would do is that they had all these hospitals set up, but like soldiers from either side, if they were kind of trying to get out or they were coming through Switzerland, they would put them in the hospital and like they were just neutral. So they'd just be like, we don't care if you're like a bad guy, a good guy. We're just going to fix you and do whatever we need to do. So that's kind of what he was doing. But apparently he had like World War I was not a fun time for him. And he was having a lot of existential crisis and whatnot. So he was having all these hallucinations and whatnot. But like I said, he decided that he was going to write it all down because he thought that it would be valuable for other people down the line. You know what I'm saying? So, as I said, since he wrote all this stuff down, we talked about the Red Book earlier. He kind of spent 16 years off and on, like, writing in it and painting in it, doing drawings and all this stuff. And when it was done, he kind of just stuck it in a drawer, and he didn't really give any instructions to his family as to what should happen to it after he died. So there was like a lot of argument about it. They did actually end up publishing it in 2009. It's actually quite beautiful if you want to take a look at it. As I said, it looks like an illustrated manuscript, because he wrote all the stuff like really, really small, like all the shit about like his journey into the interior of his psyche, I guess. Like all the shit that he came up with, he goes off on this thing. It almost sounded like it was like a Homeric epic.
Yeah.
Like the shit that he did, like in this book. It's like he went off on this, there's like fucking deserts and mountains, and I killed this beautiful youth, and I did this, that, and the other thing. You know what I mean? So it's just like this, it's this epic journey, but it all happens like inside his mind, kind of.
Yeah, and it was like kind of portrayed as some kind of fucking wild, almost like, you know what I mean, like some kind of a fucking wild spiritual paranormal fucking book that if you got your hands on it, that it might actually kind of, cause you to have paranormal experiences.
Which I guess it may if you have certain proclivities. I'm sure.
It was a trip.
I mean, as I said, it was basically just his diary entries about his dreams, the visions that he was having, and he didn't censor it. So he just basically talked about, like, last night I had a dream of this, that, and the other, or today I had a, vision that I was, going across the desert and there were all these dead people, like, coming out of this. So he just wrote things down without really worrying about if other people read it or not.
It's supposed to be paranormal.
Well, as I said, he did have a big thing about... I think that's probably why his legacy has endured, because he did really have this weird... It's almost kind of like a Timothy Leary type of thing, I want to say, because he, even though, as far as I know, he wasn't super into psychedelics or anything, but he kind of occupies that same space in the culture, where it's kind of like we're going on an internal journey.
Yeah. The Timothy Leary angle fucking really like kind of like touches home with me. Yeah, it was like a Timothy Leary.
That's kind of what I got from him, and
a Timothy Leary of his age,
before his time, sure, because you're going inward,
right?
You're going on an internal journey, and hopefully, what you come up with while you're in there is instructive for people outside to some fashion. Which I think is kind of what he was shooting for. Because, as I said, he really did believe that everyone had just these common symbologies that would reoccur in people's dreams and stuff, which is why dream interpretation is such a massive part of Jungian analysis, even to this day, because there are still Jungian analysts out there now. And that's kind of one of the first things they ask you. They kind of they ask you to start keeping a dream journal, because they think that shit that happens in your, they're like, look, even shit that happens in your dream that seems bad, like if it seems like a nightmare, it's not necessarily bad. They just have this whole really complicated system of coming up with what that dream might mean to you personally.
Right.
So, which, as I said, I'm not sure, because sometimes I think that the dreams you have aren't necessarily, I think Freud kind of had more of a point of view that dreams were wish fulfillment to some extent. Which I don't know if that's the case, because sometimes I think dreams are just fucking random imagery that doesn't...
Certain things happen in my dreams, that's not a wish, it's more like a nightmare.
Yeah, that don't necessarily mean anything. So I do kind of feel like, and I'm not saying that what people dream about doesn't mean anything, because obviously it's coming from your brain, so it must have some significance. But I think Jung was maybe on a better track with that, because he does kind of feel like, look, it's not necessarily wish fulfillment, but, the shit that you dream about, that might be some kind of symbolic, it might be important to something that you're thinking about right now. It doesn't necessarily mean it's bad. That just means that this is what's occupying your mind at the moment, and it might be coming across in this particularly symbolic sort of way.
It's funny, because, like, looking at this stuff now, there's not as much to it by today's standards as there was. I remembered it back in the day, and it was like it was bizarre. But compared to what we got going on now, in terms of, you know what I mean? Computer technology and fucking understanding of fucking the human mind and science, it is very dated, what they're talking about now. It's very dated. I mean, it's cool, but it's just, it doesn't really fucking carry over into our age as much as it did. You know.
Well, and like I said, I think some threads of it are still relevant, because you have to think that Jung did come up with shit that is probably still relevant nowadays. He was the one that came up with the inherent dichotomy between people that are, the extroversion and introversion. He did kind of establish the foundation that some people's personalities are more outward based, like they get energy from interacting from other people outside of themselves, whereas some people get more energy from or recharge by going back into themselves. Yeah. So those are two fundamental differences of personality, which I think is still kind of relevant. He did come up with that, which actually ended up being the basis of the whole like Myers-Briggs personality type thing, with like the 16 personality types, which a lot of people know nowadays. You can take fucking all kind of tests on the internet. People are still like yapping about it nowadays. Where you have like that kind of whole extroversion, introversion, like thought, feeling, intuition, that kind of stuff. That's all from Jungian thought, all of that. And even though, as I said, maybe you could call that a little bit of bullshit, but, it does have some value, I think. I've taken those Myers-Briggs tests. I'm an INTJ, if you wondered.
I just remember thinking about this kind of stuff in the 90s. And back in the 90s, it seemed more relevant back then than it does now. You know what I mean?
I suppose.
Yeah, it just does.
Yeah.
Seems like it hasn't aged as well as I remember.
But he was the one, too, that came up with, kind of the archetypes.
Yeah.
Which I feel like that's pretty relevant in fiction still. And you could talk about Joseph Campbell in this context also. Yeah. Where you have, and like I said, archetypes from a Jungian point of view are not necessarily like an image, like, oh, the hero or the mother or anything like that. He was just kind of talking about ways that I guess, I'm not really sure how I want to put it, but ways that your psyche or parts of your psyche would present themselves. It's not necessarily like an image or anything like that, but It was some, it was just a way of kind of putting into context some aspect of your psyche. So you had, stuff like, archetypal images like the mother, the hero, things like that everyone across cultures would recognize, and that recurred throughout history and recurred throughout cultures. You also had things that were like a complex, which usually I kind of feel like that's seen as negative, but he was like, not necessarily. It was just that whatever there was more stuff attached to in your mind, like you had more things attached to this particular idea than any other idea, that meant that you had a complex about it. It didn't necessarily mean that it was bad, but